The sun cast a warm glow over the bustling city streets as Jonathan John Carter, a tall, well-dressed black man in his early 40s, stepped out of his sleek black SUV. His confident stride and composed demeanor suggested success, yet he carried himself with a quiet humility that set him apart. With broad shoulders, neatly trimmed facial hair, and deep brown eyes that held wisdom beyond his years, he exuded a presence that demanded respect, though he never sought it. John was the founder and CEO of Carter Tech Solutions, one of the fastest-growing software companies in the country. His company had revolutionized financial security applications, providing access to underserved communities and bridging the digital divide. Despite his achievements, he preferred to keep a low profile, dressing in simple yet elegant attire: black slacks, a tailored navy blazer, and polished leather shoes. Though wealth and recognition followed him, John remained deeply connected to his humble beginnings. Raised by a single mother in a low-income neighborhood, he had worked tirelessly to build the life he had today. Success hadn't erased the memories of struggling to make ends meet, which was why he made it a point to support local businesses and small grocery stores rather than large corporate chains. That morning, John had one goal in mind: pick up a few essentials from Benny's Market, a family-owned store in a suburban neighborhood. He often stopped by for fresh produce and homemade bread, preferring the personal touch of a small grocer over faceless supermarket chains. But today his visit would be different, one that would expose deep-seated biases and leave an unforgettable mark. John's days were usually packed with meetings, presentations, and brainstorming sessions. As a tech entrepreneur, his schedule was relentless, but he always carved out time for things that kept him grounded. Each morning, he started his day with a run through Riverside Park, a place where he could clear his mind and prepare for the day ahead. He would return home to enjoy a black coffee and a simple breakfast, usually oatmeal or a protein shake, before diving into work. His office was a minimalist space adorned with framed photographs of his mother and a quote from Nelson Mandela: "It always seems impossible until it's done." Despite his success, John preferred a hands-on approach. He visited his company's branches regularly, mentoring young developers and ensuring that his mission, to empower communities, remained at the heart of everything. He was known for his generosity, often funding scholarships for Black students in STEM fields. But today, before heading into another meeting, he had made a spontaneous decision to visit Benny's Market. It was a small but well-loved store, one of the few that hadn't been overtaken by massive retail chains. John liked the atmosphere: friendly faces, handwritten price tags, and the smell of freshly baked bread wafting through the air. Unbeknownst to him, this simple stop would lead to a confrontation with unconscious bias, reminding him that no amount of success could shield him from certain prejudices. Benny's Market was nestled in a quiet suburban shopping strip, its vintage red and white signs slightly faded but still welcoming. Inside, the store had a warm, inviting feel. The wooden shelves were stocked with fresh produce, homemade jams, and imported spices. The scent of freshly ground coffee mixed with the aroma of warm pastries from the bakery section. Local residents shopped at a leisurely pace, exchanging pleasantries with the employees. The checkout counters were lined with old-fashioned candy bars, handwritten promotional signs, and baskets of discount items. A small bulletin board near the entrance displayed community announcements, flyers for lost pets, local events, and tutoring services. Behind the register stood Emily Ross, a 22-year-old cashier with shoulder-length blonde hair, an impatient demeanor, and an ever-present phone in her hand. Emily had only been working at Benny's for a few months, but had already gained a reputation for her dismissive attitude towards certain customers. While she was polite to well-dressed, seemingly wealthy shoppers, she was noticeably colder toward those she deemed unimportant, particularly older customers, people who asked too many questions, and, though she never admitted it outright, Black and Hispanic shoppers. That morning, as she lazily scanned groceries for a chatty elderly woman, she rolled her eyes discreetly, eager for her shift to end. The store wasn't busy, but she had little patience for small talk. She checked her phone between transactions, barely acknowledging customers unless they looked like the type who might leave a generous tip. When the front door chimed, Emily barely looked up, but she caught a glimpse of a tall Black man walking in. Her immediate thought? Probably going to ask where something is, take forever, and not by much. It was a thought she didn't even process as racist, just an unconscious assumption based on experiences she had never questioned. John, oblivious to Emily's initial reaction, walked toward the produce section. He browsed the neatly arranged fruits and vegetables, placing a few items into his basket: apples, bananas, a loaf of sourdough bread. As he moved through the store, he noticed the subtle difference in how customers were treated. A well-dressed older woman in a designer coat received a warm greeting from Emily, while a young black man in casual clothes was met with barely concealed impatience. John had seen this dynamic before, assumptions made based on appearance. He had experienced it firsthand countless times, even as a successful businessman. Some people saw his tailored suits and respected him. Others, like Emily, didn't even bother to look twice before making up their minds. He approached the counter, placing his basket down. Emily, still focused on her phone, let out a small sigh before glancing up at him. Instead of the forced smile she had given the previous customer, she simply blinked, barely masking her disinterest. With an exaggerated motion, she began scanning his items, rolling her eyes as if this was yet another inconvenience in her already exhausting day. John said nothing, for now. Emily barely concealed her impatience as she dragged each item across the scanner, her fingers tapping rhythmically against the counter. She exhaled sharply, a subtle but telling sign of irritation. John noticed. He always noticed. "That'll be $23.76, she said, monotone, not bothering to make eye contact. John reached into his wallet, pulling out a crisp $100 bill. Emily's expression shifted. Now she was actually paying attention. Her gaze flickered between the cash and his face, as if trying to reconcile the two. "We don't take big bills," she said, her voice laced with skepticism. John arched a brow. "I've paid with $100 here before." Emily folded her arms. "It's store policy." John could see it now. This wasn't about store policy. This was about her assumption that he didn't belong, that a black man holding a $100 bill must be trouble. Before he could respond, the older woman who had been in line ahead of him spoke up. "That's strange. You just took my 100 a minute ago." Emily's face flushed. She opened her mouth to reply, but hesitated. John remained calm, his voice measured. "So, which is it? A policy change in the last 5 minutes, or something else?" Emily rolled her eyes, snatching the bill from his hand with an exaggerated huff. She held it up to the light, flipping it over as if expecting it to be counterfeit. John remained silent, watching. He'd been through this before, subtle discrimination disguised as policy enforcement. But what happened next would escalate the situation beyond what even Emily had anticipated. John wasn't the type to lose his temper. Years of experience had taught him that moments like this were best handled with patience and precision. He had encountered discrimination in boardrooms, at airports, and now, apparently, at small-town grocery stores. But what truly struck him was Emily's audacity, how openly she dismissed him, how easily she assumed he wasn't worth respect. He crossed his arms, watching as she continued examining the bill, holding it up against the light, running her fingers across the surface. Customers behind him began shifting uncomfortably, sensing the unnecessary tension. Finally, she slid the bill into the register. "Guess you got lucky," she muttered, handing him his change with a forced, tight-lipped smirk. John met her gaze. "Lucky," he repeated. She shrugged, barely suppressing another eye roll. "I mean a $100 bill? It's kinda sus." John let out a quiet chuckle, not of amusement, but of realization. She truly had no idea who he was. He could have walked away, let it go. But something about this moment, the sheer confidence in her disrespect, compelled him to speak. "You assume a lot about people, don't you?" he said, his voice calm but firm. Emily shrugged again, uninterested. "I just do my job." A voice from behind interrupted the standoff. "Sir," a deep voice said. John turned to see Mr. Bennett, the store's elderly owner, approaching with a concerned expression. He had known John for years. "Is there a problem?" Before John could answer, Emily jumped in. "Oh, it's nothing. He was just making a big deal about the bill policy." Mr. Bennett's brow furrowed. "Policy? We don't have a limit on bill denominations." John exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "That's what I thought." The tension thickened. Customers were now fully engaged, whispering amongst themselves. Emily's face paled as she realized she might have just made a mistake, especially when Mr. Bennett turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Emily, can I speak to you in the back?" His voice was calm, but firm. Emily hesitated. I I was just trying to be careful. John could see it now, her realization that she had miscalculated. This wasn't just another random customer. Something about the way people were reacting told her she had misjudged the situation. Mr. Bennett looked at John apologetically. I sincerely apologize for this. John gave a small nod. He wasn't here to cause trouble, but he also wasn't here to be disrespected. Emily, flustered and suddenly defensive, turned back to John. I didn't mean anything by it, she said quickly. John held up a hand. Save it. She stared at him, confusion flashing across her face. He wasn't reacting the way she expected. Most people got angry, yelled, or stormed out. But he remained composed, controlled. And then, as if to make things worse, an older man in the crowd whispered to his wife. You don't know who that is, do you? Emily's stomach dropped. She had made a very, very big mistake. Emily's pulse quickened. She looked around, noticing how the energy in the store had shifted. The old man's whisper had set off a ripple effect. Murmurs spread through the crowd like wildfire. Who is he? She heard someone else whisper. Another customer, a middle-aged woman in a business suit, leaned toward Emily. Are you serious? You really don't know. Emily swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. She turned back to John, who stood completely still, his expression unreadable. Mr. Bennett sighed. Emily, you really don't recognize him? Emily's frustration boiled over. Why does it matter? He's just... She stopped herself, realizing too late how dismissive she sounded. John arched a brow. Go ahead. Finish your sentence. Emily clamped her mouth shut, her mind racing. She wanted to disappear. Mr. Bennett exhaled, shaking his head. Emily, meet Jonathan John Carter. The name hit the room like a shockwave. A woman in line gasped. A younger man pulled out his phone, already Googling. Even the teenage cashier at the next register stopped what he was doing, his eyes widening. Jonathan Carter wasn't just some random guy in a grocery store. He was a self-made entrepreneur, a former college basketball star, and most importantly, a philanthropist who had donated millions to this very town. Emily felt like the ground beneath her had vanished. He donated $2 million to the city's youth program last year. Mr. Bennett continued, his voice tinged with disappointment. And yet, you assumed he couldn't be trusted with $100 bill? The weight of her mistake came crashing down. The store erupted into a chorus of reactions. I saw him on the news last year, a woman said, nudging her husband. That's the guy who paid for the new gym downtown, a younger customer added. Emily could barely process what was happening. Her chest tightened as the realization set in. Not only had she been caught in an act of discrimination, but she had also disrespected someone who had done more for this town than she ever would. John, however, remained silent, watching her closely. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't angry. He was just disappointed. The worst part? That look in his eyes. It stung more than any reprimand could. Mr. Bennett sighed. Emily, I think you owe Mr. Carter an apology. Emily's mouth went dry. She felt everyone's eyes on her, waiting for her to speak. John stood still, his arms crossed, waiting. He could see the panic in Emily's eyes, the way her fingers twitched slightly as she processed the weight of the moment. He had been in situations like this before. People underestimating him, assuming the worst, treating him as less than based on nothing but their own biases. But there was something different about this moment. Maybe it was because it was happening in his own hometown. Maybe it was because he had given so much to this community, his time, his resources, his support. And yet, even here, he was still just another black man with $100 bill. The truth was, he wasn't even surprised. But he was tired. Tired of the assumptions. Tired of the disrespect. Tired of the quiet, casual racism disguised as store policy. And most of all, tired of having to be the bigger person again. Emily opened her mouth, hesitating. I didn't mean to. John sighed. Don't lie. Her mouth snapped shut. If that older woman hadn't spoken up, you would have turned me away without a second thought. His voice was calm, but firm. Wouldn't you? Emily's face burned. She had no response. John shook his head. You know, I've spent years giving back to this town. I built the gym where your younger brother plays basketball. I funded the tutoring program that helped your cousin get into college. Emily's eyes widened. How did he know? I know because I care about this place. I care about the people in it. John continued. But tell me, after all that, after everything I've done, Why is it still so easy for you to look at me and assume the worst? Silence. Emily couldn't answer, because deep down, she didn't have a good reason. And John knew it. Mr. Bennett cleared his throat. John held up a hand. It's not about me. It never was. He turned back to Emily. You probably think this is the worst moment of your life. Emily couldn't argue with that. But the real question is, what are you going to do about it? Emily blinked, caught off guard. What? John leaned forward slightly. You messed up. Big time. You can either pretend this never happened, or you can use it to actually change. Emily felt the weight of his words settle in her chest. Mr. Bennett sighed. Emily, I think it's time you take a break. We'll talk in my office. Emily hesitated, then slowly nodded, her face still pale. John gave her one last look before turning toward the door. But just before he walked out, Emily spoke. Wait. John paused. Emily swallowed hard. I don't want to be that person. For the first time since the incident started, her voice sounded genuine. John turned back, raising a brow. Then prove it. Emily followed Mr. Bennett into his office, her hands shaking slightly as she sat down across from him. The walls were lined with certificates, old photos of the store's opening, and employee awards, one of which had her name on it from just last year. She had always thought of herself as a good person. Hardworking, polite, fair. But today she had failed. Mr. Bennett sighed, running a hand over his bald head. Emily, I need to be honest with you. Emily tensed. She expected to be fired. Maybe she deserved it. You're a great worker. You're smart, dependable. But today... He shook his head. Today, you let your assumptions do the talking. Emily swallowed hard. I didn't mean to. He leaned forward. Do you even hear yourself? Do you know how many people say that after they've already done the damage? Her face burned. Mr. Bennett sighed. John Carter isn't just some wealthy guy. He's a man who's worked harder than most to get where he is. He's poured money into this community. And today, he had to stand in front of a store he's helped build while you treated him like a criminal. Emily felt like she couldn't breathe. But you know what? Mr. Bennett continued. It's not just about John. It's about how you see people. About the assumptions you make before you even know someone. Emily clenched her hands in her lap. She wanted to argue, to say she wasn't like that, but the truth sat heavy in her chest. She had judged John Carter the moment he stepped up to her register. And now, she had to live with it. Mr. Bennett exhaled. I should fire you. Emily flinched. But I won't. She looked up, shocked. Because I believe people can learn. If they're willing to. He folded his hands. But you need to prove to me, and to yourself, that you're not just going to forget this happened. Emily bit her lip. How? Start with John. Her stomach twisted. You want me to apologize again? I want you to listen to him. Mr. Bennett's gaze was firm. People like John don't owe you patience. They don't owe you explanations. But if he's willing to talk, you need to hear what he has to say. Really hear it. Emily hesitated. The thought of facing John Carter again made her heart pound. But deep down, she knew Mr. Bennett was right. If she wanted to be better, she had to face what she had done. Emily found John just outside the store, standing near his sleek black car. He was checking his phone, but when she approached, he slipped it into his pocket and turned to her. She swallowed. Can I talk to you? John studied her for a moment. That depends. Emily hesitated. On what? On whether you're here to make yourself feel better, he said, or to actually listen. His words stung, but she understood what he meant. She took a deep breath. I want to listen. John nodded once. Okay. The two of them stood in silence for a moment before Emily finally spoke. I was wrong, she admitted, her voice quiet. Not just about you. About a lot of things. John raised an eyebrow, waiting. Emily wrung her hands together. I don't think I ever realized how easily I make assumptions about people, and how much that can hurt them. John nodded slowly. That's a start. She took another breath. I don't want to be that kind of person, but I don't know how to change overnight. You don't, John said. But you choose to do better. Every day. Emily looked down. I want to. I really do. John studied her, then nodded. Then prove it. The next morning, Emily arrived at the store earlier than usual. She didn't just want to show up, she wanted to change. Her first step? Learning about John Carter. During her break, she pulled out her phone and started reading. John wasn't just a rich businessman. He had grown up in a low-income neighborhood, raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs. He had put himself through school, built his business from nothing, and had made it his mission to invest in communities like the one he came from. Her chest tightened as she read articles about the scholarships he funded, the small businesses he helped, and the donations he made quietly, expecting nothing in return. She had judged him without knowing a single thing about him. Later that day, she took another step. When John returned to the store, she didn't just greet him. She treated him with genuine respect. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice steady. "I just wanted to say thank you." John gave her a curious look. "For what?" "For your patience," she said, "and for helping people in this community, including people like me, even when we don't deserve it." For the first time, John smiled. "Just make sure you pass it on." Emily nodded. She would. Emily's perspective didn't shift overnight, but it did shift. She started paying closer attention to how she treated customers, especially the ones she might have dismissed before. When a young black man in construction clothes came through her line, she didn't just scan his items quickly to move him along. She looked up, smiled, and said, "Hope work's not too tough today." When an older woman of color hesitated over a coupon, looking embarrassed, Emily took the time to help her find a discount that worked. Slowly but surely, she unlearned the biases she never realized she had. And the best part? She didn't do it for praise. She did it because she wanted to be better. One evening, as she was closing up, Emily thought back to that moment when she had rolled her eyes at John Carter. It was such a small thing, a reflex, a moment she wouldn't have thought twice about, until it was reflected back at her. She realized that her old self might have brushed it off, might have told herself it wasn't a big deal, but it was. Because how many moments like that had she let slip by? How many times had she made someone feel less than without even noticing? She had learned that racism wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was quiet, subtle, hidden in small gestures, assumptions, and dismissive looks. And now, she refused to let it go unchecked, in herself or in others. A few weeks later, Mr. Bennett called her into his office again. "I've been watching you," he said, "and I see a real difference." Emily nodded, but she wasn't looking for approval anymore. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She was just trying to be better. "Good," she said, "because I feel different, too." As she walked out of his office, she saw John Carter leaving the store. He glanced her way, tipping his head in a nod. Emily nodded back. She had a long way to go, but she was walking in the right direction.